At her own wedding, she walked in wearing a simple white dress, and the groom laughed. But what no one knew was she was the billionaire who owned everything around them, and by the end of that night, he'd lose it all. The grand cathedral buzzed with opulence, its towering stained-glass windows casting kaleidoscopic light on the marble floor. Guests, seated in rows of gold-trimmed chairs, whispered in anticipation, dressed in designer labels and dripping with affluence. The ceremony had been hyped for months in tabloids and social media alike. This was no ordinary wedding. It was the merger of influence and power, where Ethan Price, a tech mogul with a carefully curated public persona, was to marry Ava Morgan, a woman whose background was shrouded in mystery, but whose beauty had captivated the elite. As the string quartet played the traditional march, the crowd craned their necks toward the entrance. But when the doors opened, the gasps were not of awe. They were of confusion, disbelief, and judgment. Instead of a lavish gown crafted by a famed designer, Ava walked down the aisle in a plain white cotton dress, soft, simple, unadorned. There were no jewels, no lace, no shimmering fabric to announce grandeur. She wore no makeup, no heels, just understated flats and a calm expression that neither smiled nor frowned. The whispers in the audience grew louder, heads tilted, brows furrowed, and camera phones discreetly snapped what they expected to be the biggest scandal of the year. At the altar, Ethan's smile wavered. His polished demeanor cracked as he took in the contrast between his custom tuxedo and the minimalist figure approaching him. His groomsmen exchanged glances behind him, some stifling laughter, others cringing at the apparent embarrassment. The energy in the room shifted. What was meant to be a celebration became a silent interrogation of Ava's choice, or lack thereof. The ceremony proceeded, but the magic was gone. Where there should have been warmth, there was tension. Where it should have been admiration, there was confusion. Ava stood silently, unwavering in her simplicity, while the room judged her every thread. To the uninformed, it looked like a public display of cluelessness, a bride out of touch with societal expectations. But the truth was far more intricate. Only a handful of people in the room understood the layers beneath her decision, and they said nothing. They watched, knowing Ava Morgan was not a woman to act on impulse or carelessness. Her silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. Just hours earlier, in the privacy of her suite, she had rejected the $50,000 designer gown that had been sent by Ethan's PR team. She had stood in front of a mirror and slipped into the simple white dress, sewn by a seamstress she had known since childhood. The decision was not rebellious, nor emotional. It was deliberate. She had grown up watching the world pretend, men wearing masks of confidence to hide insecurity, women adorning themselves in wealth to gain approval. She had seen what it did to people, and she had promised herself never to lose who she was. Not even on her wedding day. She had walked down that aisle fully aware of the stares, the judgments, and the quiet laughter, and she welcomed it, because she knew something no one else did. Behind her soft-spoken nature and plain exterior was a legacy few could comprehend. Ava Morgan was not a gold digger, not a charity case, not the lucky girl who landed a billionaire. She was the sole heir of Morgan Global, a discreet empire whose reach extended beyond banks, real estate, and energy. Her family name had never needed public attention. Their wealth was ancient, understated, and immeasurable, but she had chosen to live differently. At the age of 25, Ava had taken control of her inheritance and made sweeping changes. She dismantled the old board, reinvested billions into ethical startups, and built networks of influence through quiet philanthropy. She lived modestly, dressed simply, and kept a tight circle, not out of shame but to stay grounded. While other heiresses flaunted their status, Ava preserved her anonymity. Her power was never loud, it was precise. When she met Ethan at a conference in Aspen, he had mistaken her for an assistant. She had let him. Over time, they grew close, and he remained ignorant of her background. Ava watched as he showcased their relationship online, framing her as the down-to-earth girlfriend who'd kept him real. It amused her. He paraded her around to gain credibility, a man of power with a humble partner, but he never once asked her about her world, and she never offered it. Now, standing beside him at the altar, with the world watching and misunderstanding, she felt nothing but clarity. This moment, this humiliation, was her final test, not of love, but of character. The reception loomed ahead, an even grander affair than the ceremony. Celebrities, CEOs, influencers, all ready to dance, drink, and celebrate the union they believed would shake the financial world. But what they didn't know was that the real shake-up had already begun. Ava's decision to wear the plain dress was not the beginning of embarrassment. It was the beginning of exposure, not hers. Ethan's single quotes in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Ava had made quiet arrangements. Contracts had been re-evaluated. Holdings had been adjusted. Partnerships had been paused. And beneath it all, a press statement had been drafted. A statement that would change everything. Yet, not during the ceremony. Not in the presence of roses and violins. But soon, very soon. And when that moment arrived, the dress that people mocked would be remembered not as a fashion blunder, but as a symbol of silent revolution. Ava Morgan had entered the wedding in a plain dress. She would leave it in legend. The reception began in a ballroom that shimmered like a palace. Golden drapes cascaded from the ceiling. Crystal chandeliers caught the light and scattered it across the gleaming marble floors. Waiters in white gloves moved like a well-rehearsed orchestra, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Every corner of the venue oozed extravagance, curated to perfection by Ethan's public relations team. Even the floral arrangements had been imported: roses from Ecuador, orchids from Thailand flown in just for this one day. The guests entered in waves, adorned in evening wear that spoke of wealth, influence, and vanity. Each step was a performance, each toast a carefully crafted display of association and importance. The cameras returned, the flashes resumed, and yet the subject of the evening, the bride, remained. The quietest presence in the room. Ava walked into the reception just as she had into the church, unassuming, composed, and unbothered by the sea of critical eyes that trailed her every movement. She hadn't changed dresses. She hadn't freshened up her makeup because there was none. Her only accessory was the same calm expression that masked a hurricane of precision and intent. Ethan mingled with high-profile guests, laughing and shaking hands, but the edge of discomfort lingered in his body language. The online buzz had already started. Snippets of the ceremony had been uploaded in real time. Comments flooded in, some puzzled, others cruel. Memes circulated. Influencers criticized. Stylists speculated. The bride's dress, or lack thereof, had become the story. To Ethan, perception was everything, and perception was slipping. Ava sat at the head table with a poise that contrasted the chaos brewing around her. Her hands folded gently in her lap. She observed the people who had come not for love, but for leverage. Guests toasted with hollow words, praised a future built on image, and discussed business mergers under the guise of wedding cheer. But beneath the surface, something else had begun. At 7:35 p.m., 3 major financial news outlets received a sealed press release, pre-scheduled and pre-authorized by Ava Morgan's private team of legal and media professionals. The headline was simple but disruptive. Morgan Global Holdings withdraws. Investment from Pricetech Industries effective immediately. The news didn't just raise eyebrows, it set off alarms. Within minutes, financial analysts noticed that several anonymous holding companies, each with ties to Ava's estate, had begun divesting from Ethan's corporation weeks ago. Quiet sell-offs, restructuring of trusts, redirection of capital, all timed and executed with surgical precision. The story hit social media at 8:12 p.m. Back in the ballroom, guests began checking their phones more frequently. Some stood and walked away from conversations. A few started whispering. The energy changed, not with a bang, but with a gradual unraveling. Ethan's name trended online, no longer for his wedding, but for the unexpected financial collapse looming over his company. He had no idea yet, as he stood delivering a speech, one rehearsed and boastful, filled with gratitude for his bride, and excitement for the future. The world outside the ballroom was rewriting the narrative. News anchors began cutting into evening broadcasts with breaking headlines. Financial blogs speculated on the cause. Some guessed betrayal, others assumed corporate warfare. A few connected the dots back to Ava. The woman in the plain dress had just pulled the thread holding Ethan's empire together. By the time dessert was served, Pricetech stock had dipped 4%. The board of directors scheduled an emergency call. Investors panicked. Reporters called Ethan's phone. He ignored the vibrations, assuming it could wait, but it couldn't. At 9:03 p.m., Ava rose from her seat. No announcement, no drama, just a quiet exit from the ballroom through a side door flanked by security. Not Ethan's security, hers. She didn't look back. She entered a waiting car, one unbranded, unremarkable, and was driven to a helipad 2 miles away. Within minutes, she was airborne, flying over a city bathed in artificial light, its towers glittering beneath her. The chaos she had orchestrated began to crescendo. In the days to come, the story would evolve. Ethan would learn, too late, that the investor he had relied upon to secure his next merger had pulled out. The sponsorships he had lined up for his app's expansion in Asia were revoked. Media outlets once eager to profile him began digging into his past, his debts, his questionable acquisitions. And Ava, she didn't speak publicly. She issued no statement. She granted no interviews. She didn't need to, because everything she wanted to say had already been said in the silence of a wedding ceremony, in the fabric of a plain white dress, in the way she had refused to explain herself to a room that only valued sparkle and spectacle. The woman they mocked as a minimalist bride had just executed one of the quietest corporate reversals in tech history, not out of pettiness, not out of spite, but to reclaim her dignity, to preserve her identity, and to remind the world and Ethan that underestimating someone because of their appearance could be the most expensive mistake of all. As the helicopter sliced through the night sky, Ava closed her eyes, not in weariness but in peace. She had stayed true to herself, and that was all she ever needed. Ethan Price stood at the center of the ballroom, the applause fading around him, the smile frozen on his face. Cameras continued to flash, but not with admiration, with curiosity, suspicion, and veiled mockery. His team tried to regain control of the moment, but the damage had already begun to bleed into every corner of the room. The bride was gone. The press was swirling, and the first crack in his perfect world had widened into something deeper, more irreversible, that had taken only one woman, wearing one plain white dress, to trigger the unraveling of an empire. As the guests began to realize Ava was no longer present, speculation swept across the room like wildfire. Some whispered in confusion, others in veiled schadenfreude. Those closest to the financial world, however, had already connected the dots. A few guests discreetly excused themselves, clutching their phones as they walked briskly out of the venue to address the collapse in private. Ethan noticed. His smile faltered, but still, he tried to maintain control. He couldn't afford a meltdown, not in front of everyone, not on the night that was supposed to cement his dominance. He had built his public persona on charisma, confidence, and luxury. Every post, every interview, every product launch, curated to perfection. His wedding was the capstone, the final image in a gallery of success. Now, that image was tainted. What troubled Ethan most wasn't the headlines, or the sudden divestment, or the fact that his stock had taken a hit. It was the enigma of Ava's silence. Her exit hadn't been theatrical. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no accusation, no final speech. Just a subtle vanishing, as if she had never been there at all. He had spent months sculpting her into the image of his ideal partner, quiet, pretty, non-confrontational, a background character in his spotlight. He saw her simplicity as something that elevated his own complexity. But what he hadn't seen, or refused to see, was the strength within that simplicity. Her intelligence hadn't needed boasting. Her wealth hadn't needed announcement. Her power didn't need to shout. It only had to move decisively, and once. Over the next 24 hours, Ethan's world changed. Major publications picked up the story. Financial news sites reported with thinly veiled glee. Analysts tore apart price deck's latest projects, exposing flaws in the company's foundation that had been ignored in favor of flashier headlines. Ethan's board called for an emergency meeting. One investor demanded answers. Two quietly exited, and Ava, she was seen nowhere, heard from by no one. Her digital footprint remained minimal, her social media accounts inactive, her photographs few. The world now wanted to know who she was, not the version filtered through Ethan's posts, but the real woman behind the silence. Reporters scoured old archives, tracking her name to charities, business filings, and obscure trust documents. What they found shocked them. She wasn't a mystery. She was a force, just a quiet one. She had funded educational foundations across underdeveloped nations. She had established think tanks in environmental technology and anonymous partnerships. With women-led startups, she had quietly donated millions to disaster relief without branding it. And now, She had removed herself from a man who had mistaken her humility for weakness, and done so with surgical precision. Back in Ethan's world, silence turned to panic. His team scrambled to manage the fallout. They drafted statements, prepared rebuttals, and organized interviews. Ethan attempted to reclaim the narrative, calling it a misunderstanding, a creative difference, a minor disagreement between spouses. But the public wasn't buying it. Too much had happened. Too much had been exposed. And above all, the world saw what he hadn't, that Ava had never been the one trying to ride his wave. She had her own ocean dot at his penthouse days later. Ethan found himself alone, surrounded by things: imported furniture, abstract art, luxury appliances, all cold and silent. His image had always been loud, but now, in the echo of Ava's absence, the hollowness was deafening. He scrolled through their past photos, noticing how she always stood slightly back, her posture reserved, her expressions neutral. It was all there: the signs of discomfort, the moments of misalignment, the contrast between performance and authenticity. He had paraded her simplicity like a novelty. He had called it refreshing, when deep down he had meant controllable. But she had been neither. She had been deliberate. The realization landed heavily. The woman he had tried to mold had quietly dismantled the very mold he stood on. Weeks passed, and the media storm faded, replaced by the next scandal, the next outrage, the next sensation. But Ethan's fall continued, not just in the public eye, but in the eyes of those who once admired him. Investors became wary. Partners renegotiated. New projects stalled. Every step forward now felt weighted, like walking through wet cement. What once had been effortless was now a climb, not because of a conspiracy or sabotage, but because trust, that intangible currency of business and influence, had eroded. And, somewhere across the world, in a quiet estate, far from flashing cameras, Ava walked barefoot through a garden her family had tended for generations. The noise of the world did not follow her there. The judgment, the gossip, the spectacle, it had no place among the olive trees and wildflowers. She had never wanted the stage. She had only wanted truth, and now she had it. Not through confrontation, but through clarity. Not through revenge, but through re-centering. Her life would go on, untouched by the flames of ego and exposure. While others chased headlines, she moved, like wind, unseen, but always felt. Because power, real power, did not need an audience. It only needed intention. Sunday morning rose over the city like a soft breath after a storm. The noise had quieted. The online frenzy had simmered to background chatter. The public, always hungry for novelty, had moved on to new spectacles. But within Ethan Price's private world, the silence had not brought peace. It had only made the weight of everything more unbearable. The penthouse apartment that had once bustled with assistants, stylists, and photographers now sat in stillness. Furniture gleamed. From lack of use, untouched wine bottles stood on display like props in a theater long abandoned. In one corner, a custom-built digital screen still looped a presentation from a failed investor pitch, the kind where Ethan once would have spoken with bright confidence and rehearsed swagger. But no one listened now. He had become a symbol of self-inflicted ruin, not because he lost everything, but because he had failed to see what he had in the first place. The damage wasn't in the money or the press. It was in the realization that the very person he once treated as a decorative figure had been the cornerstone of every ounce of credibility he had built, and he had broken her trust, not through betrayal of loyalty, but through betrayal of respect. Ethan's spiral was not public. He did not cry on talk shows or post remorseful apologies. His fall was internal, methodical, and lonely, the worst kind. In the span of weeks, the man once described as a visionary became a cautionary tale in boardrooms and leadership workshops, the charismatic leader who mistook humility for irrelevance. It was late October when he received a letter, not an email, not a lawsuit, a letter, written in graceful penmanship on thick, cream-colored paper. It was signed, simply, Ava Morgan. There were no accusations in the letter, no demands, no condemnation, only a clear, measured acknowledgement of the past, and a statement of future boundaries. It detailed the final unwinding of all joint investments, complete separation of legal and financial assets, and a transfer of charitable obligations originally promised during the wedding into Ava's Soul Foundation. It was not cruel, it was surgical, and it left no room for misinterpretation. Ethan sat with the letter for hours. He read it over and over, trying to find some hidden emotion, some leftover warmth, but it wasn't there. Ava had moved on, not in haste, not in bitterness, but in quiet self-respect, and in that silence he began to see the woman he never really knew. Ava had never sought revenge. She hadn't needed to destroy him to prove a point. She had simply walked away with grace, with control, and with everything that mattered. She had no need to post her side of the story. She didn't justify, retaliate, or engage. She didn't need to, because when someone stands on truth, the world eventually adjusts its perspective. And Ava stood tall in a truth Ethan had never cared to understand. A few months later, Ava returned to her hometown, a coastal region nestled against green hills and quiet, winding roads. It wasn't a retreat from the world. It was a return to origin. The estate had belonged to her grandfather, a man who had taught her that real wealth was never about status. It was about stewardship. She resumed her work behind the scenes, investing in young entrepreneurs, expanding literacy programs in underserved communities, and directing quiet innovation in sustainable industries. Those close to her never mentioned the wedding, and she never offered details. The event was not a wound she carried. It was a layer she had shed. She attended her small local church every Sunday, walking barefoot through the courtyard as children played in the shade of ancient oak trees. She wore the same plain dresses she had always worn. No guards, no fanfare, no luxury cars. And yet, she commanded more respect than any billionaire could ever buy. One morning, her foundation hosted a private symposium on ethical leadership. Among the quiet guests were educators, startup founders, social workers, people whose names were not known in headlines but who carried real weight in their work. Ava stood at the edge of the gathering, listening more than speaking, offering insight only when needed. That there was no stage, no microphone, no ego. Just presence. Her impact didn't require a spotlight. It moved quietly, like roots under the soil, unseen but holding everything up. As the months passed, rumors faded, and the online narratives shifted. Ava remained untouched by gossip, untangled from spectacle. She did not need a comeback. She had never fallen. Ethan, on the other hand, attempted reinvention. He took a sabbatical. He wrote a think piece. He rebranded his startup, but none of it rang true. Investors hesitated. Former allies distanced themselves. He had the look of someone who had learned the cost of forgetting humility. But the world wasn't sure if the lesson had stuck. He attended a private summit a year later and saw a panel on responsible investment led by one of Ava's colleagues. Her name was never mentioned, but her fingerprints were there, in the philosophy, in the process, in the precision. Ethan watched quietly from the back row, no longer recognized, no longer surrounded by cameras. And in that moment, he realized he had never truly understood what power looked like until it walked away from him in silence, wearing a plain white dress. Back in her garden, Ava walked among the wild lavender, her fingers brushing against petals as the wind carried their scent. She paused beneath a fig tree, breathing in the stillness. There was no bitterness in her, no lingering regret, only peace, because the greatest revenge was never retribution. It was rebuilding in grace, rising in silence, and living in a way that made noise irrelevant. Ava had been humiliated at the altar, but she left that altar not broken, only sharpened. And in the end, she did not need applause. She had something much rarer. She had honor.